it's time to go on to the second paper of this session, LBO Financing, which is presented by Samuel Lee, Assistant Professor of Finance at Levy School of Business, Santa Clara University, and ECGI research member. The paper is a joint work with Mike Burkhardt, who is also in the audience, and Henrik Petri. Samuel, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks to the organizers for giving us an opportunity to present the paper. So the paper was on some versions of the program advertised as the social value of debt in the market for corporate control. And we have been recently nudged to include the term LBO financing in it. And for this presentation, I chose to choose the shortest possible version of that, just LBO financing. It's less cryptic, and it pretty much gives away exactly what we'll be talking about, and that may be a good thing. So our paper is a theoretical paper, and it's about the L in LBO, which you're all aware of stands for the fact that these buyouts come with extreme levels of debt financing, and but also for the special way in which the debt is being raised, which is often referred to as a bootstrap acquisition. So the way it works is that you get money from the lenders, but the money goes to the acquirer, and the acquirer uses the money to buy the target. But then ultimately, the target is the entity that is obliged to repay the debt, right? So the bidder gets the loan, and the target repays. And so this term bootstrap's been around from the beginning. In fact, the inventors of LBOs, Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts, amongst themselves used to refer to these as bootstrap deals. And it's called bootstrap because, you know, as per the term bootstrap, it means they could buy targets with little to no capital of their own. So they bootstrap the acquisition. So this is, it's almost a defining feature of LBO debt. And even when LBOs involve debt at different levels of the transaction, say at the fund level or at a holding company level, the term LBO debt typically it refers to the portion of debt that is imposed on the target. Bootstrapping, as well as the fact that so much debt is being used, you know, after all these decades, is still controversial. And you know, concerns haven't necessarily gone down with PE private equity activity having grown enormously. And so we felt it's important to grapple with the concerns, you know, not to sort of toss them away, but think about them carefully. And with at least two of us having worked on takeovers before, this is our first sort of attempt at going in that direction. Now, one of the reasons why this is still controversial, even though, as most of you are aware, we've had now a theory of LBOs for a long time, is that the dominant theory of LBOs has actually nothing to say about bootstrapping. So if free cash flow theory or Innis 90, all of those theories are about, you know, incentives, and we call this incentive benefit theory. And it's all about how the debt optimizes how the firm is run after the buyout, okay? And so the caveat of that is that it doesn't actually require bootstrapping. To stretch the point, in principle, it doesn't even require the takeover to be leveraged. You would achieve the same effect if you just bought the firm and afterwards did a leverage recapitalization, okay? Now you might say, hey, it's a matter of convenience to just, you know, lump in the takeover with the financing. Now, if you take that view, it is, you say, okay, I'm just going to do the capital structure choice together with the takeover. It should mean that, you know, buyout leverage as well as general corporate leverage should be driven by similar factors because it's in effect just a capital structure choice inside the takeover. Some people have looked into this and it's not really borne out by the data. Buyout financing seems to be driven by other factors, seems to sort of have its own life. And so these are some caveats that come with the theory. And what happens is, since the leading theory can't really speak to bootstrapping, it leaves the door open for, let's say, more cynical interpretations of bootstrapping, right? So you're going to ask, wait a second, is there maybe a dark side to this? And so I have here a quote from a US congressional testimony by Eileen Applebaum, who's a co-director of CPR and has written a book on private equity. And you can read the whole quote, but just to paraphrase it, so this was as part of Elizabeth Warren's Stop Wall Street Looting Act. And so experts were invited. And if you kind of, my way of paraphrasing this is the following. hey, if you have unusually high leverage that you don't observe anywhere else, and you see it combined with the following pattern, you load the debt on the target in a way where the PE firm actually enjoys limited liability. But then it's the PE firm that gets the money and often actually cashes out very early, pays itself fees at the time of the transaction or shortly after. And we know that the very high levels of debt in some instances impose negative externalities on other target stakeholders through financial distress and so forth. I take all of these pieces together. It's not far-fetched to say, is there something else going on here? Is that rent seeking? Are they making profit at the expense of someone else, right? And so, an old story, for example, going back to that is sort of Schleifer Summers, the workers are the stakeholders that are being squeezed. And you can sort of go in that direction and say, maybe bootstrapping has a different function. Maybe the debt is raised through bootstrapping because other than the incentive benefit, the fact that you bootstrap gives you more, okay? Now, there is a theory that formalizes this notion, and it's a paper by Müller and Panunzi in 2004 in the QJE. And they say, okay, we're going to focus on a friction not after the takeover. So how is the firm managed after the takeover? But we'll focus on a friction inside the takeover, okay? And so once you do that, it becomes necessary that the debt is actually raised in the takeover. The role of that in this paper cannot be replicated to a leverage recap afterwards. And the story is as follows: the friction in the takeover is free riding by target shareholders in the spirit of Grossman and Hart 1980. And what they show is that if you have such free riding, if you raise your debt through bootstrapping as opposed to in any other way, what happens is bootstrapping shifts profits from target shareholders to the bidders. Okay. So if I'll show a little bit later, bootstrapping effectively reduces the bid price. And at the same time, the reduction is actually extracted by the bidder in the form of debt financing. Okay, so it's a rent extraction function. Within this framework, it's unnatural that once debt allows you to extract rents, it's easy to generate the result that the bidder might be tempted to raise too much debt because it's a form of rent seeking. Okay. So they also show that if you said, hey, financial distress costs, or there would be negative externalities imposed on others, the bidder would actually raise inefficiently high levels of debt. Okay, and so it resonates with the concern I just showed you here. It's very similar in spirit. Okay. Now, this theory has two caveats. And one is the basic idea of this paper is that the use of debt through bootstrapping will make target shareholders poorer, and doesn't quite square well with the empirical evidence that target shareholders seem to be doing fairly well in LBOs, high target shareholder returns. The second problematic prediction of this theory is that competition between bidders should then reduce the use of bootstrapping because that's a way of extracting rents, inefficiently so. And so if we have to compete, then we want to leave more rents to the shareholders, so that should reduce the amount of bootstrapping that we see. But again, that's empirically not really borne out. We don't see bidder competition reducing bootstrapping or the amount of takeover debt being raised. So far I've described existing theory. And so suppose you taught these two theories in class. You said, here are some theories why, in LBO so much debt is being used. And you wanted to flesh out the implications of the existing theory for bootstrapping. Maybe you've just, showed your class the quote by Eileen Applebaum said, bootstrapping looks a bit dubious. This is what theory has to say about bootstrapping. You'd have to say on the normative side, the rent extraction theory says, look, there's definitely potential for inefficient rent seeking. So some cap on bootstrapping is probably advisable. And somebody might say, what about incentives? And you say, well, it wouldn't really affect incentive benefits because within incentive benefit theory, bootstrapping is not needed. You could still raise the debt you need for incentives later after the transaction, or you could raise it at a holding company level. Strictly speaking, you could even raise it at the fund level. Okay. But then you would have to say, now this normative prescription that a cap might be useful, comes with sort of, I don't feel very confident about it because the very theory that prescribes this makes some problematic predictions that don't seem to be consistent with the data on target returns and competition. Okay. And so what our paper does is basically say, okay, you say that at the end of class, but combining implications of two different theories is not necessarily the same as the implications of a theory that combines the two theories into one, right? So instead of combining implications of two different theories, what we're going to do is we're going to combine the key assumptions of the two theories in one theory and see if something else pops out, okay? So we're going to have a theory where we have both free riding and rent extraction in the takeover as one problem, and incentives as a second problem after the takeover. And within this unified framework, ask, what does bootstrapping do? Okay, and it turns out the point of including unifying these in one framework is, of course, now you can have an interaction between the two frictions, as opposed to having the two frictions play out separately. And turns out that matters. It overthrows quite a bit. So within this unified framework, all of a sudden, and we didn't expect this, what happens is any cap on bootstrapping in our model is inefficient. Bootstrapping is not irrelevant for incentive benefits. In our model, bootstrapping is necessary for incentive benefits. So those first two go out the window. And the problematic predictions of the pure rent extraction theory, they all disappear. Okay, so the implications of the unified theory are almost the opposite of the combined implications of the two separate theories. Okay, just in case I don't get through, here's a quick overview of the 5 main propositions of the paper. So we set up the model and then we show within the model, bootstrapping increases takeover surplus within our model through generating incentive gains. Number 2, we show that bootstrapping actually benefits target shareholders by increasing takeholder premium. So the gains that are being generated within our model are shared by the bidder and the target shareholders. So within our model, these are Pareto gains, even though bootstrapping is a rent extraction mechanism. Proposition 3, in our model, the bidder's capital contribution is optimally negative. So the bidder always cashes out early in our model. It's part of the optimal arrangement. And then we have 4 and 5. I'm going to focus mostly on 5. In our model, competition leads to more bootstrapping, leads to more rent extraction, use of the rent extraction mechanism. Okay. All right. So the model, as you can tell from the motivation, we're going to be using existing pieces and say what happens if you put them together. It's best thought of consisting of 3 elements. The heart of the model is the tender offer model by Grossman and Hart, 1980, with the free rider problem. So we're going to add to that a stage before, which involves financing. The bidder can raise financing outside equity or outside debt, as has been done by Müller and Panunzi. And the bidder can also contribute own capital. And just to keep things simple, we're going to assume the bidder has unlimited wealth. And we're later going to talk about wealth constraints and how it doesn't matter. Okay. So I have unlimited wealth, but I can choose outside equity financing and outside debt financing if I want to. Number 3, we add a stage after the takeover, where if you, as the bidder, have taken over the firm, you will now choose some effort level at a private cost to improve firm value. And obviously your incentives to do so will depend on how you have financed the takeover. Okay, very straightforward. Okay, now quickly, what does bootstrapping do? Okay, so the financing of the takeover will be done through a bootstrap acquisition. And I'm not going to show you a technically accurate description of it, but just sort of what in effect bootstrapping does. Now this looks a bit complicated, but I'll just quickly walk you through it. So the story here is that the bidder, which think of this as a PE firm, is going to create an acquisition company, a special purpose vehicle, here SPV, okay? And is going to fill up this company, this empty shell company, with money to buy a target firm. The money will come from the bidder, FB, from outside equity investors, FE, and from an outside lender, FD. Okay, you pool the money, you decide on paying target shareholders the price P, and you get the target. Now the target is going to spit out value, and the way the value is being divided is, in effect, when you have a bootstrap acquisition, the target directly repays the debt to outside lenders. That's that fat dotted line. And that's the main effect of bootstrap acquisition, of bootstrapping. Before then, the equity value is dispersed to the others. Okay. And so then the ultimate claims will be the debtor has this min D of V. The bidder has a levered equity stake, a fraction alpha of the equity, and the equity is worth V minus D, and then the outside equity investors. Now, debt has two effects. As you can see, it affects the post-takeover claims, right? If you look at the bidder, alpha times max V minus D is what the claim the bidder will hold. It's affected by D. That means incentives of the bidder will be affected by the choice of financing. Okay, that's the incentive benefit perspective. Now comes the rent extraction perspective of Müller and Pannunzi. What you also see is this red part here, the value that the post-takeover share value, right? So the value the target firm gives to equity holders is going to be max V minus D, because the more debt is imposed on the firm, the less is the equity worth. Okay. And what happens in a free rider model in Grossman and Hart is that the price P is pegged to this red value. So the mechanism in Müller and Pannunzi works the way that if you increase D, that red thing will become smaller, but that means the target shareholders are happy with a lower price. And at the same time, the value that you reduce get extracted by the bidder through that FD. You extract it as financing. So there will be two roles of that in our model, which one is the red part. It's going to be helping the bidder extract rents from target shareholders. But at the same time, the blue part, it will affect how the bidder will run the firm afterwards. Okay, question is, how do those two effects interact? Okay. So I'm trying to keep the math to a minimum, but these are some things that are just simple to convey. The model is, the spirit of the model is very simple, the way the model is solved. The bidder in our model is going to maximize her profit, but she has to, she's subjected to certain constraints. Number one, the outside investors break even. Okay, they're competitive, so they can't make a loss. Number two, and here's the free rider problem. The price that you have to pay has to satisfy this famous Grossman and Hart free rider condition, okay, which depends on D because of the rent extraction effect of bootstrapping. And then number three, the value that's being created after the takeover will depend on incentive constraints. Now, since you have equity financing and debt financing, there will be two constraints. The first one simply says the more outside equity to use, the less you're going to work, right? So, or turn it around, the more equity you own as a bidder afterwards, the more you will work. The second constraint also says outside debt will also reduce incentives, but in a different way. It can potentially create a debt overhang. So if you lever up the firm so much that your equity is out of the money, you as an equity holder will say, what am I working for? All the value goes to debt holders. So once the debt overhang kicks in, it's going to kill off equity incentives altogether.
Excuse me, Samuel, you have 3 minutes approximately. So maybe you
sorry. I thought, okay. Okay, so very quickly, then let me walk through the first two results and that would be the most important ones. Why does bootstrapping increase takeover surplus in our model? If you look at the free rider constraint, what you see is the VE here. If I as a bidder were to buy more equity, obviously I will work harder. That's going to increase the value V, but this is going to translate into a higher price P. While at the same time, the cost of creating the value will be borne by me. So what happens, the effect is here is, why am I creating more value if the value is being extracted by target shareholders and I'm the one creating the value at all this effort? And as a result of that, your incentives to actually acquire equity are being, frustrated by free riding. At the same time, you see that when you have free riding, you want to extract rents. So that's the bootstrapping result. If I increase D, the right-hand side goes down and the price goes down. And so the overall result is here, I don't want to create value, but I do want to dilute. That's the effect of free riding. And so it would seem that then you want to maximize D and you want to minimize alpha. But the problem is, of course, lenders won't go along with that freely. They're going to say, that doesn't sound like a good idea. So when you look at the debt overhang constraint, you see that the debt overhang constraint imposes a positive relationship between debt and equity. And the logic is very simple. The lender says, hey, I'm only going to lend you more if you take on sufficient equity as an incentive that I can be sure that you increase firm value enough to cover the additional debt. Okay. So the bidder is going to say, the mindset of the bidder is, how much debt can I get? Because that's my profit. And the lender will say, well, any feasible debt level comes with the required equity stake. Your rent extraction is going to be tied to stronger incentives. And this indirect incentive benefit effect of debt requires bootstrapping. Without bootstrapping, we go back to the bidder doesn't want to buy anything. Why? Because unless you can extract gains, why am I incentivizing myself? Okay, so if you put a cap on bootstrapping here, you're undermining equity consolidation and incentives. Now, the next thing we do in the paper is look at how does this affect target shareholders? And one way of looking at the debt overhang constraint is to say, look, the debt overhang constraint limits how much debt you can raise. But that means it puts a lower bound on the equity value, right? Because the equity value is just full firm value minus debt. So V minus D. Now we can ask within the model, how does this wedge V minus D change as you play around with debt? And if you take the previous story, if I go to the lender and say, I want more debt, and the debtor says, well, then you need to take more equity because we need you to exert more effort to create more value. Then whenever you get more debt D going up, you also have V going up. And the question is, what happens to V minus D, right? Because I want more D, but the lenders make me create more V to get it. So does V minus D overall, the difference go up or go down? And we show in the model that, you know, for common formulations of the incentive problem, the difference actually goes up.
You have 1 minute. If you
yes. And so the difference, remember, is the equity value, and free riding means that this is the price that the target shareholders extract. So that means what we have in our model is if the bidder uses more debt, she actually also ends up paying more to target shareholders. So we have this funny effect in our model that the lender imposed constraint on the debt equity relation has two effects. It causes bootstrapping to entail incentive gains, and at the same time, it actually imposes a sharing rule for those gains. Okay. So it reverses the problematic prediction of the pure RAT that bootstrapping is bad for target shareholders. And it's also striking because this is the first instance that we know of within the Grossman and Hart literature where the target shareholders actually don't want to input any constraint on the bidder's rent extraction mechanism because they actually end up benefiting. Okay. I'm going to skip, since I'm out of time, the other two competitions, jump straight to the summary if you allow me. So the main idea of the paper is to say some traits of LBO financing, bootstrapping, excessive leverage, early cash outs do not have a strong footing in existing theory, and they seem very dubious. And what we present is a theory in which these controversial traits emerge jointly and they end up being Pareto efficient. And the theory also bridges two existing theories in a nice way. Now, it doesn't refute there could be a dark side, but at the very least, it can offer some efficiency rationale so that can lead to a more nuanced discussion. You know, there could be a dark side, but there seems to be also a bright side. And if in a nutshell, what we show is that bootstrapping is like a silver bullet for the Burley means type of corporate governance problem, because what the bootstrapping in our model does, it's crucial for consolidating equity to restore incentives. It splits the gains from this to resolve the free rider problem, and it splits it in a way where the target shareholders say, hey, we don't want to impose any limits on the bidder's rent extraction mechanism, which is quite striking.
Thank you, Samuel. So now Franklin Allen, Professor of Finance and Economics at Imperial College of Business School and ECGI Fellow, will discuss the paper. Franklin, the floor is yours.
I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper. First of all, because it's a very interesting one, but also because I've known Samuel Lee for a long time, since he was a student helping in Harry Schmidt's chair at Goethe University. And I got to know him well while I was visiting there many years ago. So I haven't seen him for a while, so it's very nice to be able to discuss this paper that he's just presented. So how should we view private equity, and in particular LBOs? And that's the subject, obviously, of the paper. So LBOs played an extremely important part in restructuring US industry in the 1980s. It was an important part of the Reagan Revolution. It coincided and was enabled by the development of the junk bond market and the whole high yield market. And many conglomerates were broken up and subsidiaries were bought out either by outside buyers or by management using LBOs. Now, these LBOs ended up in firms being more efficiently managed in many ways and creating more profits, but it often involved workers losing their jobs, and it became a contentious process. There's a very nice movie with Danny DeVito from 1991 called Other People's Money, which some of you may have seen, which puts both sides of the argument in an interesting way, I would say. Now, LBO activity was very high during the early and mid 1980s, and then as we got towards the end of the decade and the beginning of the next, it fell off, and then it increased again a few years later, and then fell back and then increased, and so on. So one of the interesting features of LBOs is these cycles, and I'll come back to that later on. Now, this contentious nature of LBOs has come back quite recently, and Samuel did a good job of explaining some of the recent objections to it, and the Applebaum and Batt paper that they reference in the paper, and Elizabeth Warren's Wall Street Looting Act are good examples of some of the problems in political terms. Now, I'll give an even more simplified version of what the paper does than Samuel did. There are two important strands of literature that the paper brings together. The first is debt as an incentive device. Now, in the 1980s, there were two important papers that argued that one of the key advantages of debt was that it provided incentives to managers who held equity in the firm to work hard. And they mention Jensen and Innes, but they don't mention Grossman and Hart. And actually, Grossman and Hart 1982 is an even a better capture of the idea that they use in their model, which is that it's a way of pre-committing to work hard going forward. And I think that would be a nice paper to reference. Now, the second way the second strand of literature is the Grossman and Hart initiated one. So the Grossman Hart 1980 paper was extremely important to this whole way of thinking about things. And what it did was to argue that with no cost of bidding, the only equilibrium is where the target shareholders obtain all the surplus generated by the takeover. And if you have cost of bidding, then of course the equilibrium involves no takeovers because they can't recoup that cost. Now, obviously that was somewhat at odds with what was going on in the markets at the time, because what we were seeing was that there were a lot of takeovers going on. And as Samuel pointed out, the target shareholders ended up getting much of the benefit of that. So the question is, how should we, how should people think about that? And of course, that led to a very large literature on trying to model how you could undo the Grossman-Hart result. Now, Muller and Panunzi in their 2004 paper gave a very interesting theory of how the Grossman-Hart problem could be solved. And it came late in this literature, and I think it's not as well known as it deserves to be. And what they basically do is they use this idea of bootstrapping, which Samuel talked about, as the basis for their analysis. And one of the things that Samuel did in the presentation was explain bootstrapping very well. When I read the paper, I didn't get quite the same understanding of what it was, and I wasn't familiar with the term. So I think it's very good to put that in right at the front so that people grasp it early on. And the basic idea is it's this idea that you borrow against the assets of the target, and so you have to pay back from the target what you get the money early directly when you do the deal. Now, the basic idea of Panunzi and Muller and Panunzi is that if you have debt in the offer, then that allows you to overcome this Grossman-Hart problem, because it allows the people doing the deal to extract the value. So if it, take the extreme case, it was all debt, then they could just offer the value of the firm and they get it all. And that would stop this problem of the target shareholders extracting rents. So that's a very interesting idea. Now, the problem with the Muller and Panunzi analysis is that, as Samuel pointed out, most of the gains go to the shareholders, not the bidders. So, how should we think about that? And what Burkhart, Lee, and Petrie do in this paper is really to combine them in a very nice and clean way. So, how does it work? Well, rent extraction requires that takeover is leveraged. And the next step is to argue that the leverage, together with the new target manager's inside shareholding, has the effect of providing incentives to the new management to work hard, so the value of the target increases. And that's the key thing. There's now this notion that you have to work hard, you have to supply effort because of the debt, and then you've also got the shareholder, inside shareholder holdings. And that increases the value of the firm. And what they're able to show is that under certain conditions, there's an optimal level of leverage that the bidders will make use of, and that maximizes the return while increasing the value of the target through increased managerial effort. So it's this combination of the two ideas that's really neat. And what they're able to show is that, in fact, high leverage can be Pareto improving, and it works very nicely, and it improves the welfare of the target shareholders as well. So what they can do is explain why bootstrapping is so important and so widely used, and it shows why LBOs can involve so much debt compared to capital structures in conventional firms, because it has this dual effect of the two components of their theory. And one of the very nice things about this paper is that it contributes to a large set of literatures, and they do a nice job of explaining all the ones that they contribute to. Now, let me make a few comments. I would say one of the leading alternative theories is that debt involves, LBO debt involves asymmetric information. So we know that if you've got different information set, so for example, if raiders such as managers and MBOs, or outside raiders if they're experts in the firm, if they know how to improve the value of the firm by restructuring it and how much it will go up, but the existing shareholders don't, then you've got an incentive to use debt, because if you use debt, the people doing the takeover get all the surplus from increasing the value of the firm, while if you use equity, you have to share the increase in the value with the new equity holders. So one explanation, which is an alternative to what they've got, is this asymmetric information one. Now, it's tricky modeling that, because the question is why, in the usual sort of Grossman-Hart type of argument, why don't the people who see this playing out, why don't they deduce what's going on? And you know, there are the standard kinds of ways of putting sufficient frictions in the model to get a closed model with that. Now, I think one of the things that would be a very nice extension would be to include that kind of feature in their model. Their model is very much irrational expectations. Everybody knows what's going on and so forth. But if you could incorporate that kind of asymmetry of information, it would potentially provide a theory consistent with the cyclical pattern of LBOs, because what's going to happen is you're going to have the highest value people go first, and then you're going to get, as you get more and more LBOs, they're going to run out of good LBOs, and then it's not going to be so profitable, and then the whole thing will stop, which is what we observe. But then new firms will come up and generate potential gains and so on, and then we get the cyclical effect. So I think that that's one way of getting this other aspect of LBOs, which is very important to understanding them, which is this cyclicality. And as I say, I think they could do that. It might take another paper, but I think it might not just be another section in the paper. Another aspect of LBOs, which is important, is that they often involve going private and then subsequently becoming public again. And you know, I think it'd be interesting to have a few paragraphs trying to explain that in this model. And I think, you know, one way of thinking about the model is that it's an effort in terms of restructuring rather than just producing. They've got it as a fairly static model where you go through time, and you just have to make them work hard to have the firm keep producing and creating value. But we often don't see that. We often see these in and out, in and out. So, you know, the classic example is ARA, which was public, then went private, then went public, then went private, then went public again. And, you know, it would be nice to extend the theory to this kind of thing. Another thing which would be interesting if they could use their model to see, why is it that debt proportion LBOs have come down somewhat in subsequent years relative to the 1980s. So 1980s, we'd often see 90–95%, but my understanding is that in subsequent years, we haven't seen them quite that high. They've come down considerably. I think the other thing that would be very interesting would be to have a section outlining testable empirical predictions of the model. So what they've done is a very nice job of matching up the predictions of their model with what we observe, which previous models couldn't do. But it would be very, you know, that's a standard referee comment. Why don't you tell us what the new predictions of your model are that we can go out and test to see whether or not we believe it more? Some more minor comments. There's a mention of multiple equilibria in section 3.2.2, but they don't take that any further. And it would be interesting to know a little bit more about that. One of the reasons for looking at the equilibrium where we look at, maybe it's only a few sentences, but maybe there are other ones out there which are also interesting, or maybe they're not, and it's effectively, in terms of what we're interested in, unique. But I think some more discussion of that would be good. I actually started out by reading the initial version that Samuel talked about with the previous title. And in that, it wasn't quite clear to me that the proposition 4 was structured the best way. I mean, it seems to me the interesting result is that fiercer competition increases debt. And I'm not sure that's phrased in exactly the best way. The way they've done examples is to put them in the appendix. I think it might be interesting and more accessible, particularly since I think there'll be a wide audience for this paper, not just people that do corporate governance theory, but people who do corporate governance more generally. And it would be good to put some of these nice examples from the appendix into the paper. So let me just conclude. It's a very important contribution to many literatures, and it's well worth reading. I think it's going to have a big impact on the literature. And then finally, this is the Grossman and Hart 82 paper, which I think was the first paper that had this idea that debt creates incentives.
Thank you, Franklin. Someone, would you like to respond now?
Thank you, Franklin. Indeed, long time no see. It's nice to see you again. So first, thank you for your discussion. As always, you've summarized it better, explained it better than the presenter did. So I hope the point of the paper is clear to everyone now. Let me just go to jump straight to your main comments on the cyclical pattern. So another one of those well-known stylized facts about LBOs. And we have been thinking in that direction. There are clearly elements that we need to add to what we currently have to speak to those. We've toyed with some ideas. Asymmetric information was actually not among them, and I think we should give that actually some careful thought. A necessary element, just briefly, necessary element that would have to be in a model is some, which came out also in your description, is somewhat of a shock to the market, right? So a certain subset of firms all of a sudden exhibiting the potential for improvement. And I think a really nice thing to maybe consider is, so this paper that I showed, I briefly mentioned, that showed that buyout leverage seems to follow different laws than general corporate leverage, really highlights a dynamic dimension where the conditions in the debt market are crucial for both the amount of leverage taken on and leverage activity. And if you look at the retrospective of Kaplan and Holmstrom, they talk a lot about shocks, technology shocks that require restructuring. I think what we can get out of some of the ideas that you pointed out and what we have is that if you have a shock that simultaneously creates sort of uncertainty about which type, and uncertainty is now my term for your asymmetric information, uncertainty about which types of firms are the ones that are best improvable, and so there's uncertainty, you might get an effect both on potential population of targets. At the same time, you might get an effect on risk premia because of the uncertainty shock that might put a wedge between the pricing of equity and debt from public investors' perspectives. And then you get these guys coming in that know, hey, debt is very important for us to actually go through with the takeover because of the problem we described. So now we have both simultaneously a subset of firms that could be improved. We have the wedge between debt and equity, and we need debt to do that improvement. And now everything falls together in one place. And that, I think, is really a worthwhile way to go. As to your point that these firms often go public, it's kind of we don't really have a, involved answer. The way we think of it is that the moral hazard problem that we model is something that is, over a certain number of years, the firm is restructured, the effort is done, and now it's back to where it should be, and we can release it back to the public market for a while. But the more interesting aspect, I think, in this context is that another thing that goes together with the going back to public is, they raise all of this debt. And if you take a view of that, the amount of debt is optimal capital structure, it's not necessarily clear that you immediately want to start repaying the debt because you say, look, this new debt level is the optimal incentive, so we're going to keep it for a few years. But what you often observe is that they work really hard to get that debt down as quickly as possible afterwards. And our theory is fully consistent with that, because in our theory, you can say, look, the takeover leverage may be efficiently this high, even though for a standard firm in this industry, the optimal leverage would actually be lower because it didn't involve the takeover. So it is perfectly consistent to say for the takeover, it should be 90%, but then afterwards, we need to get down very quickly, right? And that would be fully consistent with our theory, not necessarily consistent with the capital structure theory of LBO leverage. Why have debt proportions come down? Again, this is a secular trend. I can't say too much here. It's something we're thinking about, but from a different angle. The way I think about this is the paper we have currently written is about explaining how one particular corporate governance tool works. I'm going to be a little bit cryptic. Now, when we observe broad trends like that, you need to consider that these broad trends may also come about because the relative advantage of one particular tool changes relative to the effectiveness of other tools that we have, okay? And I think, you know, once you then factor in activism, I think there's a story to be told here where I think we have a strong hunch, and we're working on something like this, that part of what you described here with debt proportions coming down is actually shift in the relative strength of different mechanisms, one being activism, I don't want to give away too much, which can fully explain this while being consistent with saying, but this is how this tool works. This paper's tool A works like this, but I think this broad trend you described, I think is because tool B became better over time than tool A, and then things that we see how things change. And testable empirical predictions definitely have to do that. I have a couple in mind, and we should spell that out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samuel. I now have, well, let's take Marco's questions first, and then Jeff Gordon.
Yeah, so I just have a quick question. So first of all, nice to see you, Samuel, and unfortunately not in person. I have a quick question on the empirics. So a lot of LBO targets, in fact, are private companies. They're not listed at all. So, you know, how does your, and they do use bootstrapping there. So how does that fit with your model?
That's one of the predictions that I was thinking of when Franklin was on, you need to spell out your testable predictions. So two answers to this. One is, or three actually. One is bootstrapping may still have a convenience factor of sorts, okay? But in our story, bootstrapping also has the rent extraction story, and it only works for publicly held firms, right? So one simple prediction would be, yes, there are buyouts of private targets. There are many of them actually, and numbers much more. One prediction that our model would make is that the leverage ratios would be lower for private targets than for public targets. I don't know if anyone has actually ever checked that. We haven't been, we don't know how to deal with data. But on average, one prediction would be consistent with our model is that the buyouts of private targets are less leveraged than buyouts of public targets. Now, the other thing I want to say is that, you know, I personally think, so now I've motivated this presentation by saying, look, there's a potentially dark side story to be told about bootstrapping. And now we do this thing, and all of a sudden bootstrapping looks like, you know, this savior that comes and then, you know, everything goes well with bootstrapping. I do not take a view on our paper saying, you know, that it refutes in any way any dark side explanation. But I think what my view is that with what we have, we can actually tell a much more nuanced story of what bootstrapping does. And I think it could very easily include a potential dark side. What comes from this is from my perspective, a very balanced view of what bootstrapping could be. So I'm not ruling out any other.
That's great, thank you. Franklin looks happy, and I think Gashka's just started working on his next empirical paper, so that's great.
So Jeff Gordon.
So a couple questions by this fascinating piece. First, I wonder how the model helps us appreciate the changes that have occurred in leverage buyouts over time. For example, the 80s was the period of bust-ups. Now, basically, we see leverage deals done for the operational changes. The whole nature of PE firms has changed. Among other things, the possibility for bootstrapping rent extraction from the credit suppliers, the debt suppliers, has gone down because of the need for the PE firms to engage in repeat play. And if you burn your debt suppliers in deal one, then the ability to go on for deals two and three are going to be down. So there's both the change in the nature of PE as repeat players, the change in the deals from bust ups to the operational deals, but also, as you sort of hinted, the changes in the activism effects, because presumably what activism does is eliminate potential slack that was the source of a lot of the gains in certain of the leverage deals. And so the question is, how does your model explain or help accommodate to the changes that have occurred over time, as opposed to providing kind of a static story that doesn't help us appreciate the dynamism of, of what we've observed since the first buyouts were done in the 80s.
Right. Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. And that goes with the Franklin. So let me first say, if I just took I think to properly answer these questions, one has to expand the analytical framework. But just a few simple observations. As you said, from bus stops to different types of improvement strategies, which also goes together with different types of targets, right? So back in the days, you wouldn't have thought about doing an LBO for technology firms because tangible assets, where are they? How are we going to get the debt and so forth? I think one way that would play out, if we take a very simple view in our model, is remember our bidder wants to use debt to extract rents. But the only limit you have to extracting rents is the debt overhang constraint, where the lender says, look, with this particular target, if you take on too much debt, it's going to be detrimental for your post-takeover incentives. So the whole equilibrium in ours is a balance between I want to rate this firm versus, but I can't go too far because otherwise I'm going to destroy my incentives. This constraint is going to bind at different levels for debt for different types of targets and different types of improvement strategies. So you could very well think that this is more binding when you say all of a sudden have a target with less tangible assets and so forth that would push down your leverage. On the point of, the repeat relationship, someone has looked at this theoretically and actually came to the opposite conclusion. So there's a paper by Malenko, I believe. I think Nadia Malenko is actually on the paper, which that says, look, once this is a repeat relationship and I can't just burn my bridges with the lenders, that's actually going to allow me to use more debt as opposed to less debt, because the reputation is going to give me that extra incentive to, even if my static debt overhang constraint would be violated, I'm still going to exert effort because I need to keep that bridge intact. So that would have the effect of actually relaxing our debt overhang constraint. You can actually get more debt from the lenders because they know that you're not going to burn that bridge because you need me in your next deal. And then finally to the activism. So that's the sort of cryptic answer that I gave to Franklin Allen about, look, this is about tool A, what about tool B? And I actually believe many of the patterns we see are about the relative strengths of tool A versus 2B, including even maybe the amount of leverage being used in buyouts. But that's something that Mike and I are currently working on. And I'm very happy to see that both you and Franklin are pushing in that direction, because we are kind of feeling that is a very promising direction to think both the cyclicality, the secular trends, and how this all plays together with the financing. Thank you.